All right, well, good afternoon. This is the final video in our AMI week series, if you will. So after this video is posted, you have all the videos, all the reading, and even the audio book where I read the book for you. So all this needs to be done by Monday. Should be no excuse on the reading because you can just listen to me, and these videos ain't too bad, right? Certainly easier than being in class, but you need to make sure you read. Today we'll be going over what is covered in pages 243 to 249, or listen, read and listen at the same time. And you need to watch this and take notes over South Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. So these are the regions we're talking about. Remember, South Asia is this area: Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh. Southeast Asia is all of this, right? From about Burma to Australia. But then we consider Australia, Oceania, all the islands, New Zealand, Australia out here. And then the Americas, North and South America. We'll separate it like the United States, and then we'll talk about Mexico, and then the rest of Latin America. So this is what you need to know. With the exception of the United States, these areas suffered the same imperialist fate as Africa and China, whether direct or through economic means. Terms you must know that are on the course and exam description: the Cherokee, we'll talk about the Cherokee Nation, the 1857 rebellion in India, the Maori people in New Zealand, iron mining in India, the propaganda and Katipunan movements in the Philippines. Okay, so let's get right to it. Well, quickly, let's do a short review over India. Remember where we left off in India, the Mughal Empire, which had grown under Akbar the Great and was flourishing. Well, it begins to fracture, especially when the very militant Muslim Aurangzeb takes over. He actually is not religiously tolerant like Akbar, and he provokes the Sikhs who live in this region, the Punjab, to rebel and to secede because he kills their leader, the Guru, remember? Then these guys in the middle who are very Hindu, remember Hindus and Muslims in India, they're clashing, right? They don't really work together. They disagree a whole lot. Remember, Islam is one God. We do not do depictions of gods. In Hinduism, there's many gods. They love to venerate and depict them. So it's just very different, right? And so they decide to form the Maratha Empire and they secede. And so in the midst of this chaos, Europeans show up. That certainly doesn't help, right? First, of course, the Portuguese. Remember, they round Africa. That's when they round the Cape of Good Hope. We talked about Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama, right? And then the Dutch show up as well too. But then the two main players in India are France and the UK, and they take hold, especially in coastal ports. But what happens is the First World War, the 7 Years' War, the English will defeat at Plassey the French and the Mughal allies, and they effectively take control of India. This will be their crown jewel in their empire. And you see here a depiction of the Battle of Plassey, the Mughals surrendering there. And so in 1765, the red is the extent of the British, but by 1800, this will be greatly expanded. The Maratha will fall, the Sikhs will fall, and others like the Mysore kingdom will fall to the English. Now, they are not directly governing it. It is the British East India Company that's really calling the shots here until about 1860. And so they are granted a monopoly charter, of course, by the government. And the British East India Company is making money by cotton. The cotton industry is exploding, of course. The cotton gin is invented, and so it makes the thriving cotton agriculture that had already taken place, that was already in India. The Mughals had a rich cotton background too. It makes it far more profitable. Add in British industrialization and textiles, the demand for cotton increases. Of course, we talked about opium in China. Where is the British getting this? Where are the British getting this opium? They're growing it themselves in India, right? Also, there's mining of iron in India. The British get a lot of iron from India, and the conditions in these mines are very tough, especially in the north, along the Ganges River and the mountains of the Himalayas. Tea and spices are also coming from India as well. But what's interesting is the British East India Company is not using a lot of Britons for it. They are using what historians call native elites to expand and centralize and to do all the work themselves. If you remember, the land-owning zamindars, the nobility, if you will, in India, are actually co-opted by the British, and they are used to govern and collect taxes, though there is some corruption. And by the turn of a century, the zamindars are kind of waned off because they were taking a lot more taxes than what was required and keeping some of it for themselves, and there was a bad famine. And so they're like, okay, let's get away from those zamindars. They still do use them to some extent, but they fix the bureaucracy to where they use British East India Company people themselves. But they'll also use native soldiers called sepoys. Sepoys, but they're trained in English methods, tactics, and technology, just like soldiers from the United Kingdom would be. And the British East India Company actually actively discouraged conversion. So you had sepoys who were Hindu and who were Muslim and some who were Christian, right? And so they were trying to stave off conflict by not converting. They did, however, work to combat some of the nastiness of the Hindu caste system, including the untouchables, the Dalit class. And actively, I remember I showed you that video at the beginning of the year of the soldier who ran to stop the sati ritual from happening and tried to stop the sati ritual of the Hindus. Remember, this is where the woman, the wife, is burned on the funeral fire of her dead husband, right? And they certainly in this period, 1800 to 1850, India is seeing massive transformation as Western-style schools, railroads, telegraphs, roads, canals, dams, English. I mean, all these things being brought in are transforming this continent, the subcontinent of India. They take the white man's burden to the extreme. Now, there are a lot of advancements, but of course, there is some downfall. Where we saw advancements, it was really just to help the British East India Company and the English who were there. It brought an end to the native cottage industry, especially in things like cotton textiles. And so a lot of these places, women had a major role in the cottage industry as it was typical. But when the factory system starts to take hold in India, that's no longer, right? And people, the men and women in the household who used to have control over their income and whatnot, they no longer do. And many of them go to work on cotton opium plantations. They go and work in iron mines. They go work in factories. They become native elites. They are subject to British rule in India. However, eventually, by 1857, there is large resentment that has built up, especially with the sepoys who had contractual obligations changed to where there was cuts in pay in terms of agreement. There was also an unsubstantiated rumor that cartridges, which were no longer using muzzleloaders, they would use cartridges in Lee Enfield rifles that you would put in, and then you would close shut, shoot, and then it would eject. And what happened was after you ejected it, because it was hot and it was metal on metal, it had to be lubed. And so they would lube them with grease, oftentimes things like palm oil. But there's a rumor that they had purposefully lubed the cartridges with pig and cow fat. Of course, if you're Muslim, you're not going to be touching no pig. And if you're Hindu, they venerate cows. You're not going to be touching no cow fat. And so they thought they did this on purpose. And so all this stuff thrown together leads the sepoys to revolt. And this, I was taught that this was called the Sepoy Mutiny, but historians get away from this term because it puts like so much emphasis on the sepoys themselves. But this was a bigger revolt than that. There was other followers than just the sepoys. Though because they had been trained in the British methods, tactics, and technology, they were a very formidable opponent. Sometimes it's called the Indian Revolt, but on your test, in your CED, it is called the 1857 Rebellion. So that's what I will refer to it as, the 1857 Rebellion. British civilians are brutally massacred in many places, and so the English retaliate. Full-on war is happening, a civil war, if you will, in India. And so the Sepoys had actually attempted to call on the last sultan of the Mughal Empire, and they said he's going to be our new leader. But here's the problem: they were unable to unify because, again, you had unconverted Muslim, Hindu, and Christian Sepoys. They're not going to rally around this guy who's really been out of power for 50, 60 years, right? Who's a Muslim. So the UK really puts it down because the Sepoy Mutiny had no unifying factor and no really end goal, right? And so they retaliate with reprisals, executions, and the British East India Company is shut down. And Britain will take, kind of like what happened in, I had mentioned in the Dutch East Indies in 1799, the company went bankrupt, and so the government took it over. Well, they don't go bankrupt. They will go defunct in 1874, I believe, the British East India Company. But the British government comes in, makes this a crown colony, as it had done in some other places like America before the American Revolution. And they say, okay, we're no longer the Sepoys and native elites like the Zamindars. We're not going to use them anymore, though they do use some of them in some extent. It's not like they stop using Indians to fight. Indian soldiers will make up a large group of British manpower in World War I and World War II. But using Zamindars and Sepoys as native elites with hardly any oversight is going to end. And so what happens is far more English people actually go to India. And so in 1885, we'll see the creation of an Indian national liberation movement. This is a term you need to know, a national liberation movement, like the Continental Congress, if you will, in the American Revolution, these groups that want freedom. It's going to start, and it's the Indian National Congress. This is the group that people like Mahatma Gandhi were a part of, and this is still the largest political party in India today, the Indian National Congress. But it starts out as a freedom movement, a national liberation movement against the British colonial power. And so we have here a depiction of the Sepoys dressed and with the manners of the British soldier, with the technology and techniques as well. And so they put up a very harsh fight against the British, but will ultimately be put down. That's the 1857 rebellion. Here is a Zamindar. Look, he ain't doing too bad off. He looks like Mr. Rivet, right? And so he was very wealthy and very powerful. But after the 1857 rebellion and after the British take charge, people like the Zamindars and Sepoys are going to lose their positions of prominence. You see here Indians, a depiction of Indians loading cotton. Cotton trade is a big thing. And this is a market where they are actually packing opium. So opium for sale. And then the depiction of very harsh conditions in the iron mines in India. And this stuff is going to go on. Still to this day, this stuff happens, but under British rule until the 1940s, after World War II. And so they call this, whenever Britain directly controls India, they call this the Raj, the British Raj, R-A-J. Okay, let's talk about Southeast Asia. Of course, this is like modern day Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, those areas. This place is rich in resources like rubber plantations abound here, and petroleum, especially in the Dutch East Indies, modern day Indonesia. There are oil fields there still to this day. They're making a lot of oil money there. Of course, spices, these were the Spice Islands, cotton and other metals. So the Dutch East India Company is running the Spice Islands, that's modern day Indonesia. They were granted a monopoly charter, but they go defunct in 1799, and the government takes over and centralizes and administers authority under the Dutch government in Indonesia. In the meantime, just after this, actually, the United Kingdom will take Burma, which is just east of India, and the strategic island of Singapore, which is a naval base that they will control until after World War II. And remember, if we looked at, I'll show you the map here, but remember when we looked at the Strait of Malacca, there was an island right at the end, a very strategic point. That is Singapore there. Remember all the shipping that goes through there? That'd be a great place to have a naval base, because if you're shipping from China to India, that's where you have to go, right? And the French will take Indochina, which includes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, from China, because they have their tributary system. They can't hold on to it. So by 1885, France has solidified in Indochina. And France in Africa and Indochina colonizes in a lot of the same way as Britain. They use native elites as well. They, however, are far more keen on converting their people to Catholicism. And so if you go to these places today, even like in West Africa or Vietnam, there are large amounts of Catholics there as well. Thailand noticeably will remain free because it industrializes and provides a convenient buffer zone to France and Indochina and the UK and Burma and Malay. And they will begin to align with Japan. They're not as strong as Japan or as industrious as Japan, but they will actually align with them in World War II. And this begins now because they are not a colonial power. They are not a colony, but they are a monarchy, an absolute monarchy at that. And still to this day, the same house that was in power, the dynasty that was in power, is still in power. I believe the current king is Rama the 10th. And if you listen to the news today, you'll hear about stuff that's going on there because he's very powerful. And Thailand is an evolving country. It's still very modern in the sense, I guess, if you can say that, though they're not, certainly not a bastion of democracy. And right next door in Myanmar, what used to be Burma, they are having like revolution as we speak. They're having the military there has done a coup, and so there's a lot of stuff going on in this region. We kind of glaze over it in this class, but it is an interesting stuff that's going on there. Now, of course, the Spanish colony of the Philippines that had been that since 1527, since Magellan died there, right, and they claimed it for the Philippines, with the very strategically important city of Manila, which I think at this time is like over 1 million people. It's one of the largest cities in the world, actually, is taken by the United States in the Spanish-American War. It's one of the first things. So the United States had a naval squadron that was stationed in Hong Kong, actually, under Admiral George Dewey. That's called the Asia Squadron. And so they get the memo, they sail over in the Battle of Manila Bay, and they take it like within a day, destroying the little French fleet, that little Spanish fleet that was there. But what had been going on in the Philippines was called the propaganda movement, where native leaders, some of those native elites, were actually saying, okay, we don't want to be a colony of Spain anymore. We're fine with Spanish control. Well, we just want to be a province of Spain. We want to be equal with any other part of Spain, right? Well, Spain wasn't going to do that for racist reasons, and they were making money off the colony, right? And so the propaganda movement will kind of evolve into a more radical movement called the Katipunan movement. This is a national liberation movement that said, okay, we're going to seek independence from Spain and then later the United States. However, the U.S. is not going to just, they beat Spain. They're going to keep the Philippines because they want a sphere of influence and naval bases in the growingly important East Asia region, right? And so they're going to harden down on the Philippines with military action against the Katipunan National Liberation Movement. And so the United States will fight a short but bloody war. I think 20,000 Filipinos die, several thousand Americans. This is called the Philippine-American War. And the rebels are led by a very charismatic leader. His name is Emilio Aguinaldo. They are not successful, though, as the United States will hold on to the Philippines until after World War II. Notably, the United States taking the Philippines and fighting in the Philippines inspires that poem I showed you guys by Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden. He wasn't talking, even though he was an English administrator in India, he was writing about the Philippines. And so this is Emilio Aguinaldo. Man, I like that right there. He's got that high collar, that black bow tie, that white suit, total stud there. But a depiction of the brutal fighting that took place here. Notably, if any of you are gun enthusiasts, the 45 ACP round was developed for use in the fighting in the Philippine-American War, because the Filipino insurgents would actually get high on coke. I mean, they were doing crack cocaine. And before this, they used a 38 long Colt round in the revolver, and it didn't have enough stopping power. And they would empty 6 shots into these guys, but they were on coke and they were still fighting. And so they actually did some tests on bigger, fatter, slower, heavier rounds. And that's where we got 45 ACP. And they tested it against like dead horses, and they would hang the horses and see which round moved the horses the most. And so they developed 45 because of that. And so by 1903, we have semi-automatic pistols. So before in revolver, you had a cylinder which holds 6 shots, and it shoots one at a time and then moves the cylinder. Well, by 1903, the U.S. Army is experimenting with semi-automatic pistols, as is depicted in this photo. And it uses a magazine that you load, and it shoots one at a time, but there's no cylinder moving it. And as fast as you can shoot, it will shoot. And these bigger, fatter rounds, the 45, which will be used by U.S. military still to this day in some parts, but by most everyone up through the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. The oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, right? Which a major oil producing region still to this day. Here's a map of Southeast Asia, the Philippines, right, under American control. The Dutch, who control Indonesia. Here is the Strait of Malacca, and look at the very strategic island there of Singapore, right? Major naval base there, the British. They call it the Gibraltar of the East. So if we look at the Mediterranean Sea where Spain and Morocco come down, they call that Gibraltar, and the British have a base there. They still have their base to this day in Gibraltar, though. And then the French in Indochina, this is the modern day country of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Here's free Thailand, and then Burma. Okay, let's talk about Australia and Oceania. So there was an explorer at the end of the 18th century. A lot of countries are financing exploration, and the British, they financed this guy, James Cook, to do some exploration in the Pacific. The French financed a guy, his name was La Perouse, but he died. Like, we don't even know what happened to him to this day. The whole expedition was lost. In fact, supposedly, the last thing Louis XVI said before he got the guillotine was, any news of La Perouse? And then they got his head cut off. So very interesting. But James Cook does a lot of exploring and mapping of the Pacific Ocean. And I'll show you a map here in a second. He went all over the place. I think he sailed 3 times. But, you know, he discovers Australia, and the people who live there, the natives there, are called the Aborigines. And he discovers New Zealand, and the natives there are called the Maori. Now, these people are, remember when we talked at the very beginning in units 1 and 2 about the Polynesian migrations? These are their descendants. And as far as we know, New Zealand may have been like one of the last places that humans got to. We think the Polynesians maybe got to New Zealand, even some people say as late as 1300. So there was no one on New Zealand until 1300. Some people put around 1200, so around that time. Hawaii had no one on it until 900, right? So the Maori, we think, 900 to 1200. So the Maori are they're of Polynesian descent, and they are on New Zealand not even 400 years before James Cook shows up. So it's just kind of, I think it's just a neat little thing there. But the Aborigines and the Maori are the natives in these places. And let's think about our experience with how Europeans dealt with natives in the past. And the other times we talked about colonization. What do you think is going to happen here? And so, like Australia will initially be a penal colony. It is a place of punishment. It's like a big prison. And convicts used to be punished with something called transportation. And so a lot of those people became like indentured servants, remember, and would go to the Americas. They can't do that anymore because America is independent. And so they would be transported to these penal colonies to work in Australia. But things are going pretty well in Australia, if you can believe it. And they grow rapidly. I think it said by the end of this unit, it has over 1 million people in Australia. And Australia and New Zealand become settler colonies like Canada and South Africa, especially for miners, rich resources in the mountains and the desert and the plains of Australia and New Zealand. And sheep farmers. Today, there's more sheep in Australia and New Zealand than there are people, right? So sheep do very well in the plains and the grasslands of those places. And you make a lot of money off sheep. But like I said, the settlers fight with the Aborigines and the Maori. And the Maori, it's especially bad. The Maori attempt their very best to actually drive out the settlers. But by the 1850s, 1860s, they are pretty well displaced. A lot of these places, they're put on reservation systems, not unlike the United States. A lot of them die from disease too. It's just a bad deal. Comparable to like the settlers and the Boers back in Africa with the Zulu and the Osha. And the French and Germans do settle some islands in the Pacific. The Germans settle Papua New Guinea and the Caroline Islands, and they'll hold those until World War One. And the French settle places like New Caledonia and French Polynesia, Tahiti, which they control still to this day, actually. So France has colonies, their colonies effectively in the Pacific. But the United States will do a five-finger discount of Alaska. They get Alaska from Russia for a really good deal. And they straight up yoink Hawaii. They set up a coup there. So Hawaii was a kingdom on its own. And there was it had unified by the beginning of this unit, about 1750, 1800. And it understood, because it was a major trading post, it got news. It wasn't totally isolated, major stopping and trading post. And it understood what was happening all around it. And it had to westernize, modernize, industrialize. But it was too little and too late. And so what happened was Hawaii invited, I'm speaking metaphorically, invited a lot of American planters there. People like Sanford P. Dole, and they had large pineapple, banana, and sugar plantations. And so it was being economically imperialized by the United States. Well, there's a very nationalist queen, Queen Liliuokalani, who said in 1893 that she was going to change the Constitution and make it to where they could actually fight off and control these American companies like Dole's. It was called the Hawaiian Pineapple Company, I believe. But we now call it Dole today. If you get bananas and you see the Dole, that's that company. And so the United States and the planters there, Sanford P. Dole, who would actually be like the president of Hawaii for a short time after he led a coup against them, they overthrow the queen, and Hawaii is annexed by the United States in 1899. So straight up economic imperialism goes to straight up colony, right, in Hawaii. So here's James Cook, and here's the maps of his exploration. He will actually stop in Hawaii, and he's killed. I mean, he's killed in like 1782. I know I'm wrong on that year, but around that time period. And so they go back without him. But look, they go and find, all these islands, Australia, New Zealand. They get pretty close to Antarctica. They see some like Antarctic islands. And visit all these various islands through here, stop Hawaii, go up to Alaska, go to America, go to Russia and Japan. So just all over the place, right? And so these are mapped and this is published. And so Europeans say, okay, let's get involved in the Pacific. The population density of Australia, this we call the outback. That's right. And so most people still today live in the major cities on the coast. And there's a big thing right here called it's a big thing of coral called the Great Barrier Reef. So not a lot of people live here because even though it's on the water, you can't get ships in and out, and you just can't live in the desert outback. The Aborigines do live in the bush though, because they were pushed out. Here's the Aborigine people. Man, they are really cool. I wish I could study this culture more. They have a very rich musical culture. They use instruments that they make themselves. One is a instrument called the didgeridoo. You've heard of that before. People study them because, like, a lot of anthropologists think they are the most pristine culture that has, because only until 1800 were they really mixed in any way, because Australia wasn't discovered yet. With other cultures. And so they like study their religion and music and food and just kind of see what they think. And they believe religiously in a thing called the dream time. Actually, this is in your textbook. We just didn't talk about the first unit because it's not going to be on the test. But the dream time is like this state, this mental state of being where, I mean, I don't even know how to explain it. And we don't really know how to explain it. The word dream time comes from like this English anthropologist from the 1950s who was just trying to make sense of what it was. We don't even know how to really translate the word, but it's like the pre-cosmos and how everything came to be. And they can like meditate and go in and out from dimensions. And I mean, I'm serious. It's some pretty cool stuff called the dream time. I have a work of Aboriginal art in my classroom. It's funny. They do their art. We call it X-ray art because they'll draw the animal and then draw like its skeleton and intestines. It's just really kind of weird how they do the art. You can look it up. Aboriginal X-ray art. It's just really neat. Okay, and these are the Maori people. If you have ever, what's the movie? Moana. That's the Maori people, the Polynesians, right? They do the face tattoos and very rich culture there. We've talked about them before. The Maori and the Polynesians used outrigger canoes. Remember us talking about outrigger canoes to travel from all these islands and use the hand system to map the stars, would take chickens, but also rats with them. Just a lot of neat stuff going on. So they're rocking in New Zealand until James Cook and other people show up there. And here is the sheep, right? That's a boy sheep. He's got his big horns there, and they're going to shear him off. And what they did is wool is, of course, what you get a sheep's wool, and they use this in clothes. You can still get wool clothes today. Wool is important. I should have mentioned this earlier because even if it's wet, it can maintain its warmth, and so it's good for staying warm. And so they'll make like military uniforms and clothes out of wool. Big wool industry. This is Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii. This is actually her in England. She's up there with monarchs, right? And so they invited Queen Victoria invited her to the United Kingdom, but it didn't matter. In fact, at first they asked Hawaii asked the U.S. for help because France was trying to take Hawaii over, and so the U.S. is like, what about that whole Monroe Doctrine thing? We're not doing that. And then that was like the 1840s, 1850s, and so and that's when she kind of shows up on the spot. And this is a sugar plantation in Hawaii. And still today, I'm going to Hawaii this summer. I can't wait. And still to this day, they have fruit, sugar stuff there. All right. I'm not going to talk a lot about the United States because Jack did that in class. But I will just quickly review some of the key stuff you should know. Again, a lot of this is not really on the test, but like the United States' role in the world is important, I guess. And it's how it deals with natives is important also in the social history. So originally from Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, that area, the natives there called the Cherokee saw what was happening in early U.S. history with the natives. And so they attempt to civilize. They create a government that has a constitution. They borrow it effectively from the United States. Sequoia creates an alphabet, but none of it's good enough. They have slaves. I mean, they have everything going on. They have a little state, right? But the U.S. Pushes them out 1830 in the Indian Removal Act, Andrew Jackson, that whole thing. And so they say, head over to Arkansas and Oklahoma. It's great there. Well, other Native Americans do resist because this is the story of the United States until 1920 with Native Americans is make a deal, break it, make a deal, break it, and just push them more and more west. So some natives do stand up as they had from the beginning of British and French colonial history in the Americas. We call these the Indian Wars. That's what it's called in the whole of the Americas. The Indian Wars, we use that term for Mexico and for Latin America, Indian Wars, where there was straight up fighting, but also there was millenarian movements as well, like the ghost dance. Remember, I have a depiction of the ghost dance here. This was really practiced by the Sioux, but this was done in Oklahoma up until like 1914, where they believed through the use of dance, and some of them used peyote, a flower, I think it's a cactus actually, that was like opium that was, made you high. They believed that spirits would fight for them, protect them from bullets, stuff like that. But it didn't work. And they would end up being pushed onto reservations. And many of these reservations still exist today in the United States. So the U.S. is growing politically, economically, physically, industrially, in every way, right? They had had problems with slavery up until the 1860s. It's the foundational issue in the Civil War, where the South tries to secede, but they don't, they lose, and they're brought back together. Slavery is ended, though, by 1865. And the beginning of the U.S. history, of course, is very small. It was just the East Coast, but it's going to grow and grow. This idea is called manifest destiny, the idea that the United States is destined by God to manifest itself from East to West Coast. And so it will begin this in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. Remember, Napoleon gets his butt kicked in Haiti, says, forget America. We're going to sell it to you, America. How much do you want? Well, at first, America went to him, said, hey, we just want New Orleans and like some land around New Orleans. He said, I'll sell you the whole thing. They said that. So we got Louisiana Purchase, right? And then we go to war with the new Republic of Mexico in the 1840s. They've only been around for 20 years. So big bad bully America shows up and takes half of Mexico. That's the Mexican cession. And so now we're literally sea to sea because that gets us California, right? And of course, through the Indian Wars, we take more and more Indian land. We also we buy some land from the United States, from the United Kingdom. We buy Alaska, the Spanish-American War. We get lands in the Pacific. We also get Puerto Rico, right? Parts of Cuba. We get Hawaii. We do the coup in Hawaii. And so we're like growing all over the place. And the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, and much of the Pacific and Caribbean is considered the United States' sphere of influence, especially after the Monroe Doctrine, where President Monroe says, I believe 1823, that it will be the policy of the United States to consider any European intervention in the Western Hemisphere as a violent act. And this is purely American, and this is our sphere of influence, right? And so where other countries had established spheres of influence in Asia and Africa, the United States was the whole of the Americas, right? Because the United States is the land of opportunity, democracy, republicanism, jobs, and lots of land, immigrants go there. Like over 17 million immigrants flock there by the end of this year. And so a lot of them do a lot of that industrializing work, but it leads to large anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. So here's the growth of the United States. You see the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican cession here, and then Alaska, some of the big ones we've talked about here. The ghost dance depiction, it's on a handbag. I thought this was really funny. If you got a female history teacher, she'd probably like this as a gift. But here's a political cartoon, the United States, Monroe Doctrine, hands off, and it says America. This is the Americas, Africa, Europe. This is our sphere of influence, right? Mexico, we left off in Mexico. They had their independence movement under Miguel Hidalgo. They have a couple years as a empire under Iturbide, but he's out of here. And then for like 20 years, they're trying to figure this whole republicanism out. They have a leader, George Santa Anna, and he's on and off general president. They get into a war with the United States in the some problems have been going on with modern day Texas in the 1830s. But in the 1840s, they come to loggerheads with the United States. And what happens is the United States beats them, and basically everything later, this would be finalized, this line here, but they take half of Mexico. And so the United States gets sea to shining sea. And so Mexico, after this, kind of has a really back period. Santa Anna's out. But there is eventually some stability. And that comes after the Mexican-American War with this guy, President Benito Juarez. And still, he's considered like a founding father of the modern Mexico. He's still revered today, kind of like a George Washington or Abraham Lincoln figure in Mexico. He is a liberal for sure. liberalism in the John Stuart Mill sense. And from about 1850s to 1870s, he's running the show in Mexico. He fixes the tax system. He does some land reforms where he takes land from the church and from the rich elite and spreads that out. He importantly in Mexico, remember I said the Catholic Church is very strong in Mexico. Still this day is very influential, but they will finally separate church and state. Used to, like, it was one thing in Mexico. The Catholic Church and the government worked hand in hand. That's no longer going to be the case. And interestingly enough, during the American Civil War, why America's at bay and it can't really focus on that whole Monroe Doctrine thing, France will try to set up a friendly emperor, Maximilian, in Mexico. And for like 3 years, Benito Juarez and the Mexicans have to fight off French attempts of controlling Mexico. And they eventually are successful there. So all of that is happening under Benito Juarez. He's considered, this great guy because of that. But Mexico and other Latin American democracies will fall into the hands of strong men who use charisma, military, and a lot of times money and oppression to rule. And we call those caudillos. And one of those caudillos that takes power, we'll talk more about next unit, is Porfirio Diaz, who about 10 years after Benito Juarez will be Mexico's president, and he will last until the Mexican Revolution, which takes place around 1910, 1911. And this is him. If you ever see a picture of a guy and he's got to wear all this, he's compensating for something, right? He's a caudillo. He's trying to show he's powerful, right? We like to think of the United States as, and I think the media does this, and a lot of woke history, does this too. The United States is the big bad racist people. And certainly that is in our past. But like we talked about pogroms in Russia, we talked about the Dreyfus affair in France. We've talked about the slave trade, not only in the United States, but Brazil and Cuba. We talked about the East African slave trade by Muslim states. We've talked about the British in India. We've talked about the Chinese and the Boxers. I mean, we issues like this, racism and class inequality, are everywhere. It is especially a problem, though, in Latin America because of the still more or less prominent existent caste system, right? Hindus with the caste system, Japanese with the Japanese caste system. This is not a uniquely American problem. It's everywhere. We just hear about America because of the news and stuff. Doesn't mean it's right, but it doesn't mean we're alone. And so racism and social inequality is still a problem in Mexico and the rest of Latin America. In fact, they will go through Indian wars there as well. You see here on this map in the Yucatan Peninsula, this is like Cozumel, this area, Progreso. You've been there probably, maybe. They will have a long Indian war with the Mayan people. This is called like the Yucatan War or the Maya War of Independence. It's called all sorts of things. We just call it the Indian Wars. And if you want to mention one, say the Mayans in the Yucatan or the Mayans in Mexico. And this will last for like 70 years, on and off war with Mayan natives here against Mexican control. So that's very interesting, kind of how that works out. Okay, let's look at this. The primary source. This is titled Bolivar's Death. Who's that? Bolivar? What? Well, that's Simon Bolivar, 1830, right? 1850, he writes the letter from Jamaica. He's dead by 1830. He was 47 when he died. 47, wow. But let's look at this picture. How does everyone look? Well, he looks dead, you're right. Do they look happy or sad? He looks sad. No one looks happy. He don't look sad though. Maybe they're worried. Yeah. Because what's going to happen after the guy that we put so much into is dead? Well, that's the problem for the rest of Latin America. Simon Bolivar will help establish those governments, right? Jose de San Martin helped him out, but he will actually personally work on constitutions. But he dies in 1830, and one of the last things he said was, "We gained our independence, but at the loss of everything else." And so he thinks a lot of the revolutions are in vain. And they are. So remember when we talked about how he got a lot of people to get on his side because he's like, I'm all about the Enlightenment. let's end the caste system. Let's end slavery. Let's end racism. Let's be free from Spain. Okay, the free from Spain part is like the only thing that happened, right? Slavery continues. The caste system more or less still exists. Even if it's out, it's still in. You know what I mean? A lot of people talk today about systemic racism. I guess this is the systemic caste system, right? In fact, slavery will be codified in places like Cuba and Brazil until the late 1880s. I think Brazil's 1888, right? And so, and even though there's not slavery in these other places, the coerced labor in some of these conditions may as well be slavery, right? But see, all of these places were ex-colonies, and a lot of them will just fail to or not be able to industrialize and will rely on resource extraction and plantation monoculture still to this day, especially for things like guano. Remember, guano is bat and bird poop that is high in nitrogen and ammonia. Now, this is on the course exam description. You got to know guano. And they will take it, grind it up, and they use it for fertilizer. They use it for all sorts of stuff, even food and medicine and makeup, but they use it for fertilizer. And this helps agricultural yields in places where, we can grow more and more crops. It sucks out of the ground. Well, put some fertilizer on. I don't have to wait, and then I can put it back on. Sugar and coffee and rubber are still big. Bananas, of course, go and watch the economic imperialism video. Bananas and other fruits, and beef, cattle from places like Argentina and Uruguay are big as well, especially for places like the United Kingdom where they can't devote a lot of land to cattle and metals. In fact, some of the rubber plantations in the Putumayo region in Peru were found to be just as rough as in the Belgian Congo, basically slavery, right? And just terrible treatment of especially the Amerindians, the natives in Peru who had to work those rubber plantations. So like I said, racism and social inequality because of the prevalence of the caste system and the really bad economic situation there. If you got a job, it was probably in one of these fields of resource extraction or plantation monoculture. Now, again, Europe does kind of get involved, but this is like the sphere of influence of the US, especially after the Monroe Doctrine. Though France, like I said, will attempt to take over Mexico, the United Kingdom does some like financial stuff. They go to these new countries like Argentina, and they basically finance the building of the port city, Buenos Aires, in the 1880s, 1920s, right? And Spain still does have colonies that didn't get totally free, like Cuba and Puerto Rico. They will finally be not Spanish anymore after the Spanish-American War. But conditions there were really bad, especially in these places that wanted to be free, like their friends in the other Latin American places, but weren't for another 60 years. And so they're kind of jealous and they're kind of rough, right? There's a national liberation movement in Cuba who's led by a poet, Jose Marti. I should have got some of the stuff he wrote. I'm just now thinking about that. Wrote some really beautiful stuff. Look at some of his poetry where he talks about Cuba and freedom. But see, Cuba had a military governor there. His name was Valfero Vayler, I believe. They called him the Butcher. And he would come at these national liberationists, those who followed Jose Marti, and he would put them in concentration camps, just like what was happening in German Southwest Africa with the Herero, right? Just as bad stuff there. Or the British in South Africa with the Boers. And a lot of people died. It was very gruesome conditions in Cuba. Anyway, so the United States comes in. The United States will actually take Puerto Rico, but they kind of go on and off with Cuba. They still have a part of Cuba today and Puerto Rico today. That part in Cuba is Guantanamo Bay, a very important naval base. But Cuba is free, but not really. Again, it's that economic imperialism, that sphere of influence until roughly World War II. And then there will be a communist revolution there. We'll talk about that later. So economic imperialism, not only by the United States, which does it personally, I guess, in Panama, where they finance and build the Panama Canal, but by these big companies like the United Fruit Company. Man, have I mentioned this like in every video, the United Fruit Company? It's very important. Located in New Orleans, But the United Fruit Company has economic tentacles all throughout Latin America, where they're using these places as basically just huge plantations, like the Guatemala plantation, where they grow stuff like pineapples and bananas. And then they flood that stuff in the United States. There's big demand for it, right? Pineapple upside down cake, bananas Foster. We'll talk about that when we talk about the early 1900s. But basically, go back to Guatemala. So here comes United Fruit Company. They say things like, well, do you want to keep your job? Do you want to stay in as president of Guatemala? Well, then you make sure you produce these bananas. You keep these people in line, right? And so, oh no, we don't control them, but you do. They're slaves. They're economic slaves of these big companies. And the United States will back a lot of this up. In fact, leading up to the Spanish-American War, the United Fruit Company was involved in places like Cuba. And in Cuba, the United States will send a gunboat, remember that gunboat diplomacy, the USS Maine, to protect the people and their economic interest. Well, the problem is the Maine blew up and the Spanish-American War was on. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, right? And then we'd find out like 80 years later that it probably blew up on accident. Rip. And then the Maroons still exist. I mentioned this last unit. This is an example of native and slave resistance. A lot of these natives and slaves would escape to islands or parts of swamps. And some of them were so large that like native, local governments had to like work with them because they would like block off rivers and stuff. I mean, it's just some crazy stuff there. You see an example in the movie The Patriot, Mel Gibson, wonderful movie, not totally historically accurate, but where he goes to a Maroon community in like North Carolina and they are they're taking care of these revolutionaries. That was kind of what was going on in these places in Latin America. Of course, cattle, very important, especially in Uruguay and Argentina. And that beef would be shipped out of here, right here is the port of Buenos Aires. And of course, we have new technology like refrigeration. And so they can cut up the beef and then they can ship it to the United Kingdom who needs cheap beef. Keep shipping us beef and we'll help build a port for you, Buenos Aires. See, that's how economic imperialism works, right? And here's penguins on an island in Chile. And they're going to get all that poop, that guano, high in nitrogen. They use it for fertilizer, right? Jose Marti, who's in Cuba, right? He's a poet that is leading intellectually the national liberation movement there. It is arguably successful, arguably not successful, because they do get liberation, kind of, from the United States. These are natives in the Putumayo region in Peru who are literally slaves on this rubber plantation. Again, not all that much better from the Belgian Congo. The Panama Canal, which is right here. Of course, look, if I'm shipping something from Miami to LA, used to I had to go all the way down. But now look, I can just go beep. And so the United States will finance, build, and own. It's a colony of the United States until 1980, until Jimmy Carter's term, 76 to 80. I can't tell you the year off the top of my head. I want to say it's 1980, 1979 maybe. But a long time, almost 100 years, right? And then a depiction of a captain of Maroons, these native and slave leaders who escape on islands or little swamps or beaches, and they were running the show from where they are. So let's look at this map of Latin America. Of course, here's Mexico. It used to be bigger, but Mexican-American War, they lost a lot to the United States. The United States is growing. Mexico, important guy you need to know, Benito Juarez. He's considered like the founder of modern Mexico, great liberalizer and reformer. He will go away though, and there's a Caudillo Porfirio Diaz who will take over after him. Cuba and Puerto Rico, there's a national liberation movement in Cuba led by the poet Jose Martin. They are still controlled by Spain until the Spanish-American War. The United States liberates Cuba, owns Puerto Rico. All of these places, though, are free, but often caudillos will take over, or they'll be economically imperialized by companies like the United Fruit Company or Great Britain by, hey, we'll build a port, just give us some beef in Buenos Aires. And a lot of these places were resorted to what they had done as colonies, resource extraction and agriculture, like in the rubber plantations in Putumayo's region in Peru, where you see this terrible depiction here. and things like guano as well, and along the coast of Peru, Ecuador, Chile, other places, islands throughout the Pacific. They use the guano for fertilizer. And the Panama Canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific, much shorter, easier route there. Okay, that's all I can think of. Guys, make sure you watch this, take notes. I'll see you Monday. I can't wait. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the share, and I hope you guys have a wonderful evening.